Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
Performing as a German acrobat who captivated audiences with her daring routines, Louisita Leers was photographed around 1929 at the height of her career, embodying the bold, boundary-pushing spirit of Weimar-era entertainment culture. By 1931, Manhattan had become the defining image of modern American ambition, its skyline dense with newly risen towers built during the very decade that the Great Depression had begun dismantling the prosperity that funded them. Taken in the late 1880s, this school photograph of a 10-year-old Joseph Stalin captures the ordinary Georgian childhood of the boy, who would seize control of the Soviet Union and reshape the 20th century through terror and iron authority. Photographed in 2000 at the age of 24, Alexei Navalny appears years before he would become Russia's most prominent opposition leader, and ultimately a prisoner who died in a Russian penal colony in 2024. In 1910, a father and his son share a moment of unguarded playfulness, a rare candid glimpse into private family life during an era when photographs were formal occasions rather than everyday records. In 1937 England, a coal miner sits down to dinner with his wife after a shift underground, a quiet domestic scene that carries the full weight of working-class life during the Depression years. In 1904, an immigrant family steps onto American soil at Ellis Island, joining the millions who passed through that narrow gateway in search of a life the country had not yet decided whether to offer them. Photographed in 1913, an Inuit man reads a copy of the Saturday Evening Post, a striking image of two worlds in contact, set against decades of sweeping change pressing into Arctic communities. Crafted to mimic cattle hooves on the soles of shoes, these cow shoes were worn during the 1920s Prohibition era by illegal distillers working in open terrain, disguising their footprints to evade law enforcement tracking them through fields and forests. Photographed in 1880, the year before he was shot dead at 21, Billy the Kid had already earned the reputation of having killed 21 men, making this restored portrait one of the most scrutinized images of the American frontier outlaw era. Documented in 1909, this Mongolian shaman represents a tradition of spiritual practice stretching back centuries across the steppe, captured at a moment when the outside world was only beginning to photograph the cultures it had long overlooked. Taken in late May 1944 at Auschwitz II Birkenau, this photograph shows a small child handing a dandelion to an older boy among a group of Hungarian Jews waiting in the selection area, people who within hours would be murdered in the gas chambers. In the early 20th century, Japanese physician Fukushi Masaichi preserved and archived approximately 2,000 samples of tattooed human skin harvested during autopsies, after first observing in 1926 that tattoo ink appeared to suppress syphilitic skin lesions. Photographed in 1916 at the age of 48, Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, would abdicate the throne just 1 year later, ending 304 years of Romanov rule that had begun in 1613. In the 1880s, the parents of newborn quadruplets posed for a formal portrait, a moment of private astonishment preserved in the stiff, deliberate photographic conventions of a century when such births carried extraordinary risk and rarity. Photographed in the early 20th century, this young Sicilian woman stands as a quiet document of rural Mediterranean life in an era of mass emigration, when millions were leaving the island for America and Northern Europe. Taken in 1916 inside a World War I trench, this photograph of a shell-shocked soldier records the visible psychological collapse that the industrial scale of that war inflicted on men long before medicine had the language to name it. Captured in 1910, this photograph of a University of Illinois college dormitory offers a precise window into the shared material world of early American student life, from its furnishings to the social habits arranged within its walls. Photographed in 1977 on the set of Star Wars, the cast appears without their costumes, a behind-the-scenes record of the production that would redefine Hollywood filmmaking and permanently alter the global entertainment industry. Photographed in March 1946, this general view taken from near the hypocenter of Hiroshima shows a city reduced to a flat, unbroken field of ruins. The physical record of the first atomic bomb ever used in war, dropped on the 6th of August 1945. Downtown Manhattan stood buried under snow during the blizzard of 1888, one of the most destructive winter storms ever recorded in American history, paralyzing the city and exposing the fragility of modern urban infrastructure at the height of the Gilded Age. A woman photographs herself in a dresser mirror using an early box camera around 1900, producing what stands among the earliest known self-portraits ever captured by a private individual using personal photographic equipment. On the set of a streetcar named Desire around 1951, Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh share a relaxed moment between takes, two of the most formidable acting talents of their generation brought together for one of Hollywood's landmark productions. Athletes stand in formation before packed stadium crowds at the first modern Olympics held in Athens, Greece in 1896, marking the revival of a tradition that had been dormant for 15 centuries and would grow into the world's largest sporting event. A couple sits together at the water's edge for a picnic sometime in the 1950s, a quietly ordinary scene that captures the domestic ease and unhurried leisure that defined post-war life for many Americans during that decade. At the Madison Square Boys Club in 1953, a group of youngsters reads 3D comic books wearing the distinctive cardboard glasses required to experience the visual effect, documenting a short-lived but intensely popular cultural craze of early post-war America. Boys from Ardingly School line up in 1927, departing for the Christmas holidays, their orderly rows and period clothing offering a precise window into the structured rhythms of British boarding school life between the two world wars. Willie, General George S. Patton's dog, is photographed on the day of his owner's death in 1945, the animal's presence serving as a quietly affecting final detail in the biography of one of the Second World War's most commanding figures. A young female welder adjusts her goggles in Groton, Connecticut in 1943, photographed by Bernard Hoffman, placing a human face on the millions of American women who entered industrial work during the Second World War to sustain the national war effort. Gas masks designed to fit infant faces are tested on babies during a gas drill at a London hospital in 1940. A stark record of how thoroughly the threat of aerial chemical attack had penetrated every corner of British civilian life during the Blitz. Steven Spielberg's mechanical shark Bruce, built for Jaws in 1975, sits exposed on set. The physical reality of the prop, a reminder that one of cinema's most influential monsters was achieved entirely through practical engineering rather than digital technology. A Korean boatman rests during a well-deserved break around 1904, the photograph preserving an unhurried human moment at the precise historical threshold when Korea stood on the edge of Japanese annexation in the end of its century's old independence. Jack Nicholson's 1954 high school portrait captures the future Oscar-winning actor at 17, offering no visible sign of the screen presence that would eventually make him one of the most recognizable performers in the history of American cinema. A 17-year-old Pelle Fay stands in Sweden before the start of the 1958 World Cup, photographed at the moment just before he would become the youngest player ever to compete in the tournament and announce himself to a watching world. Tens of thousands of concertgoers make their way to the Summer Jam at Watkins Glen, New York in 1973, one of the largest rock festival gatherings in American history, drawing an estimated crowd that dwarfed even the legendary attendance at Woodstock 4 years earlier. John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier are photographed on their wedding day in 1953 by Tony Frisell, capturing a union that would, within 8 years, place them at the center of one of the most scrutinized presidencies in American political history. A vast organ-pipe cactus dominates the Baja California landscape in this 1895 photograph by Leon Deguay, its enormous scale testifying to a specimen that likely took centuries to reach that height in one of the most arid environments in North America. Alfred Hitchcock is photographed at the age of 24, born the 13th of August 1899, the image preserving the future director of Psycho and Vertigo as a young man still years away from the films that would redefine the grammar of cinematic suspense. Photographer Margaret Bourke. White perches on an eagle-shaped gargoyle at the top of the Chrysler Building in 1930, the image fusing two icons of the same era, one of America's most daring photojournalists and its most celebrated Art Deco skyscraper. A medical officer of health measures the width of passageways in Liverpool in 1907, a routine act of urban inspection that reflects the period's growing public health movement and its systematic effort to bring scientific standards into the conditions of city life. The reception desk of the General Motors Technical Center, photographed in Kodachrome by Balthazar Korab in 1965 and designed by architect Eero Saarinen, stands as a document of mid-century modernism applied to American corporate architecture at the height of the automobile age. An aerial view of New York City taken in 1951 reveals the full density of the built environment at a moment when the city stood at the peak of its post-war population and its uncontested position as the economic capital of the Western world. Residents of Chicago's South Side dress in their Sunday best in 1941, a photograph that documents both the dignity and the specific cultural traditions of black urban life in a city still defined by the Great Migration of the preceding decades. Babies are strapped into airplane seats on the 12th of April 1975 during Operation Babylift, as orphaned Vietnamese children were airlifted to the United States in the final weeks before the fall of Saigon brought the American involvement in Vietnam to its end. Side by side, Lincoln's first and last presidential portraits from May 1860 and February 1865 document 4 years of war compressed into a single face, the physical toll of the presidency made visible without a single word of explanation required. The Beatles performed their last live concert together on the rooftop of Apple Records headquarters in London in 1969, an unannounced appearance that brought traffic below to a standstill and brought down the curtain on a decade they had largely defined. A small family stands before their home in the early 1900s, the photograph offering no drama beyond the quiet fact of their presence, ordinary lives recorded at a moment when documentary photography was only beginning to preserve such unremarkable and irreplaceable scenes. The rarely seen dry interior of Hoover Dam is photographed in 1936 before the Colorado River filled the reservoir, exposing the full engineered geometry of one of the largest construction projects the United States government had ever attempted to that point. London's first computer, the fastest in the world at 1 megahertz, is photographed in May 1950, its vast physical scale a reminder of how recently the entire processing power now held in a pocket device once required a dedicated institutional facility. 18,000 men are arranged into the shape of the Statue of Liberty in Iowa in 1918 for a single photograph, a feat of mass choreography that channeled the enormous scale of American military mobilization during the final year of the First World War. Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary are photographed together after reaching the summit of Mount Everest on May 28, 1953, documenting the first confirmed human ascent of the highest point on Earth, an achievement that had defeated every previous expedition sent to attempt it. Salvador Dalfé is photographed in 1954 by Philippe Halsman, The portrait produced by a collaboration between two artists, each committed to treating the photographic image as an extension of imagination, rather than a simple mechanical record of observable fact. The Statue of Liberty takes shape in a Paris workshop between 1877 and 1885, the construction photographs recording the enormous scale of the engineering effort required to fabricate a gift that would become the most recognized symbol of American democratic ideals. An old nail woman in Algeria is photographed in 1949 wearing the facial tattoo customary for dancers of her community, a document of a living cultural tradition that was already being eroded by decades of French colonial presence in North Africa. Manhattan's skyline in 1887 is consumed by an extraordinary tangle of telephone wires, the visual chaos capturing the moment when the city's infrastructure was being improvised in real time to meet the demands of a communication technology only a decade old. Tourists stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon in 1880, photographed at a time when reaching the site required considerable effort, and the canyon itself had only recently been formally surveyed and mapped by the United States government's geographic expeditions. Two West German girls speak through a barbed wire fence with their grandparents on the eastern side in 1961, a photograph taken in the early weeks after the border was sealed and families across Germany were abruptly divided by Cold War politics. French archaeologist Joseph Haken is photographed exploring the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan. In 1931, the colossal 6th century carvings still intact in the cliff face where they had stood for 13 centuries before their destruction by the Taliban in 2001. A vintage Japanese postcard from the late 1910s or early 1920s survives as a document of everyday visual culture in the Taisho period, a brief era of relative liberalism and Western influence that shaped modern Japanese urban identity before the militarist decade that followed. A woman photographs herself in a mirror around the year 1900, the image standing among the earliest known examples of the self-portrait tradition that personal photography would eventually make universal, though in this moment the act was still a novelty available to very few. The Priscilla nuclear test detonates during Operation Plum Bob in 1957, photographed by the Las Vegas News Bureau, one of a series of above-ground detonations conducted in the Nevada desert that collectively exposed hundreds of thousands of American civilians and military personnel to radiation. Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and Buzz Aldrin are photographed chatting over drinks in Houston in 1969 by Ralph Morse, the casual domesticity of the image standing in complete contrast to the mission. They were weeks away from completing above the lunar surface. The Mona Lisa is returned to the Louvre in 1945 after the war, photographed by Roger Violet, the painting having been evacuated from the museum in 1939 to protect it from German occupation, and now restored to the gallery that had housed it for centuries. Bob Ross is captured in a 1983 portrait, years before his public television program. The joy of painting would make his calm instructional style and his philosophy of effortless creation a genuinely iconic piece of American broadcast culture. The real models who posed for Grant Wood's American Gothic are photographed together in the 1930s, placing human faces behind the two figures, whose stoic expressions in Wood's painting had already become one of the most recognizable images in the history of American art. Oxford Arms in Warwick Lane, London, is photographed in 1875, the galleried coaching inn already an architectural anachronism at the moment of capture, a survivor of a pre-railway urban landscape that was disappearing rapidly under the pressure of Victorian commercial redevelopment. Irish seaman Tom Crean holds an armful of sled dog puppies during Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Trans Antarctic expedition in 1915, the image offering a moment of uncomplicated warmth inside one of the most grueling and dangerous polar voyages in the history of exploration. Ice skaters take to a frozen surface in 1937, the photograph capturing a leisure practice that had sustained a mass following for decades before indoor rinks and changing winters would steadily reduce the culture of outdoor skating to a seasonal rarity in most cities. Yuri Gagarin, the first human being to travel into space, stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, a biographical detail that quietly complicates the heroic scale projected onto the Soviet cosmonaut, who in 1961 became the most famous living person on the planet. The 1906 Krieger electric carriage stands as evidence that battery-powered personal vehicles were a viable commercial technology more than a century before electric cars were widely regarded as a serious alternative to the internal combustion engine that would come to dominate the 20th century. Pablo Picasso uses long-exposure light painting techniques in 1949 to draw in mid-air with a light source, the photograph capturing one of the most celebrated visual artists in history, engaged in a form of image, making that existed entirely outside the medium he had mastered. The original cast of Sesame Street is photographed together in 1969 and 1970, documenting the launch of a children's television program that was deliberately designed to use the conventions of commercial broadcasting to close the educational gap facing underprivileged children in the United States. Muhammad Ali is photographed letting a young fan win a staged fight in 1963, the image revealing the public personality of a 21-year-old boxer who had not yet won the world heavyweight title but was already mastering the theater that would define his public life. American paratroopers with mohawk, cut hair are briefed in France in 1945 before their jump across the Rhine. The radical haircut's a deliberate act of psychological preparation that marked the specific gravity of an airborne assault in the final campaign of the European War. James Dean is photographed with his Porsche 550 Spider, the car he called Lil Bastard, an image inseparable from the knowledge that Dean would die behind its wheel in September 1955, making the photograph one of the most retrospectively weighted images in Hollywood history. A Coca-Cola delivery truck is photographed in the 1920s, the image documenting the early logistics of a distribution network that was already in the process of making a single American soft drink brand recognizable in more countries than almost any other consumer product on Earth. Albert Einstein is photographed taking a nap in his yard in Berlin in 1933, the image made in the same year he left Germany permanently following the Nazi rise to power, though the photograph itself records a moment of complete and ordinary domestic rest. A mother propels herself forward on a bicycle in 1926, while simultaneously pushing a pram ahead of her, the image of improvised dual-purpose transportation offering a wry and entirely unposed document of the practical ingenuity demanded by everyday domestic life in that era. Michael Jordan is photographed mid-flight at the 1985 Slam Dunk Contest, the image capturing the athlete who would eventually become the most commercially dominant figure in basketball history at the precise moment his physical gifts were first being displayed before a national audience. A restaurant owner posts a handwritten sign during the New York City blackout of the 13th of July, 1977. A small act of individual response to an event that left 9 million people without power and exposed deep fault lines in the city's infrastructure and social order. The control room of German submarine UB-110, photographed in 1918, documents the compressed mechanical complexity required to operate an underwater vessel in combat, the equipment filling every available surface inside a hull that offered its crew almost no separation between work and survival. James Brown is photographed at Long Island Airport in 1967 by Jean-Marie P. Ferrier, the image preserving the performer at the peak of his creative influence, 3 years after his Apollo Theater recordings had established him as the defining figure of American soul and funk music. Paris in the early 1900s is captured in street photography that documents the city at the threshold between the Belle Époque and the decade of industrial warfare that would transform European civilization beyond recognition within a generation of these unhurried street scenes. Bruce Lee trains with his mentor Ip Man in 1956 at the age of 16, the photograph documenting the master-student relationship through which one of the most influential martial artists of the 20th century received the Wing Chun foundation of his later practice. A family of 4 rides a single scooter through Palermo, Italy in 1963, photographed by Bruno Barbi, the image of improvised, unconcerned mobility capturing something essential about daily life in southern Italy during the economic recovery years of the post-war Italian miracle. A shoe shine takes place on a London street in 1936, the quiet transactional exchange captured at a moment when street-level service economies of this kind were still deeply woven into the everyday fabric of urban working-class life across British cities. The view from the torch of the Statue of Liberty, looking down across the crowned stone hair, is photographed around 1930, a vantage point so rarely seen that it transforms one of the world's most familiar monuments into something briefly unrecognizable and strange. Street performers are photographed in Paris in 1950 by Mario Dondero, the image placing human spontaneity and public spectacle at the center of a city rebuilding its cultural confidence in the years immediately following the liberation from 4 years of German occupation. A general store in Pony, Montana, is photographed in 1939, the interior a document of rural American commerce at a moment when small frontier towns like this one were already being drawn into the economic disruptions that had followed the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Pedestrians crowd around a television store in Italy to watch the 1960 Olympics through the shop window, the image capturing the precise moment when broadcast television first delivered live international sport to mass audiences who did not yet own the sets required to watch at home. An Italian woman examines the kilts of Scottish pipe majors at the Colosseum in Rome in 1944, the image placing a perfectly domestic act of civilian curiosity directly inside the military geography of a city that had been liberated from German occupation that same year. The mirror cap of 1929 is photographed as a wearable novelty device, a small cultural artifact of the late Jazz Age that sits somewhere between practical accessory and social absurdity, its precise function less important than what it suggests about the era's appetite for visual play. A group of chefs performs rooftop exercises in Germany around 1930, the organized physical training of kitchen professionals captured in an image that sits at the intersection of the era's enthusiasm for collective physical culture and the ordinary working lives of tradespeople. Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese are photographed by Steve Shapiro on the set of Taxi Driver, A Behind. The scenes document of the collaboration between a director and actor whose combined work in the 1970s would reshape the ambitions and grammar of American independent cinema. Robert Kennedy stops for lunch while campaigning for his brother in Bluefield, West Virginia in 1960, photographed by Bob Lerner, the image placing one of the decade's most significant political figures in the unglamorous practical geography of a presidential campaign stop in a coal country town. German soldiers and their mule wear gas masks around 1916, the photograph drawing together human and animal into a shared vulnerability that the industrial logic of chemical warfare had imposed equally across species on the battlefields of the First World War. Gregory Peck is photographed reading To Kill a Mockingbird by Cliff Donaldson, a portrait of the actor who would win the Academy Award for his portrayal of Atticus Finch, pictured with the Harper Lee novel whose story he had been chosen to bring to the screen. Children leap between floating ice blocks in Sweden in 1930, the photograph catching a moment of physical risk embraced as ordinary play, the water below presumably cold enough to make the game genuinely dangerous and the jumpers apparently indifferent to the fact. 21,000 soldiers are arranged at Camp Sherman, Ohio in 1918 to form a portrait of President Woodrow Wilson, photographed by Arthur S. Moll and John D. Thomas in a feat of living human portraiture that used the scale of wartime military mobilization as its medium. Waterloo Place in London is photographed in atmospheric conditions by Leonard Masson in 1899, The image using fog and diffused light to transform a familiar urban space into something closer to a study in mood, a technique that placed Masson at the edge of pictorialist photography. Thousands gather around a replica of the Statue of Liberty on Broad Street in Philadelphia on the 11th of November 1918, now known as Armistice Day, celebrating the end of a war that had killed over 17 million people and redefined the political geography of the modern world.